The topic of my is called Manifesting Tectonic in Search of Theatricality. I always have an interest in performance and theater as well as other forms of narration when growing up. I believe that the power of a narrative can influence designers in the process of making, as well as the ongoing dialogue after a project is ended. An architecture known as a multidisciplinary field, my hope is to mingle existing architecture knowledge with other disciplines such as performance, language, literature. In other words, architecture design should be somehow ambivalent and open-ending. This is also the page from my material outcome manual of elements, which you can find on the mirror board as well. So the first piece that I look into is this book, The Theater and Its Double, by French dramatist Antoine Artaud. And he's famous for his conceptualization of theater of cruelty, which speculates on the interrelationships between humans' behaviors and thoughts. In this writing, he critically points out that there is a lack of interactions in Western traditional theater that is largely rely on the literary text and speech. The relationship between audience and actors, between speech and narrative of the story is rather passive. Taking inspiration from the performance he witnesses from the Bolognese theater, he is shocked by the physical intensity and psychological effect that is produced. True feelings and art of everyday life for him is untranslatable, and the only way we can grasp them is through gesture, quote, a many-hued spatial language, as he suggests, in which we can perhaps grasp the reality from the void of a manifestation creates in our mind. Artaud further reinforces his argument by dissecting the performance of a snake charmer. The snake performs by twisting his or her body upon the music from time to time. The vibration of the sound and its frequency induce the long coil nature of the snake's body. Hence the performance here being conducted on the snake, as you can see from the diagram too, is both cognitive and biological. A dynamic space is generated here solely on the interaction between external stimuli and subject self. A different kind of spatiality is created and recreated throughout the performance, which is the action that is always in process. To a large extent, the prototype or the diagram you see here that is being invested throughout my research also resonate with Artaud's idea of gesture. Gesture is used both physically and conceptually to communicate the relationship between object and subjects, and the capacity in which one could conduct or could not the other through cognition and perception. My main concern in this research is not trying to problem solve or dive deep into analyzing the cognitive psychological aspect behind those behaviors, but rather to examine the process in which those situations might take place. In other words, I'm more interested into problematizing the concept of gesture as a way to unfold spatiality in the field of architecture. Based on the idea of conducting acts by means of organism, he also considered his major work, Theater of Cruelty, as a total spectacle, meaning that audiences are blurred with the actors on this open stage in the center. Sets of contradictory forces will produce physical shock to stimulate their senses, and in order to retrieve the, quote, nerve and heart that has been missing in the traditional theater. My takeaway from his work is how he sets up the stage and narrates the story. Those are the criteria that I set up for my performance to take place, as you can see from this plan diagram. Continuing with this kind of contradictory forces and narrative structure shown in both Artaud's and my design, what is hoped to draw is a sense of carnivalesque. So basically, by using performance in the form of satire or parody on streets, a dialogical space is created based on different interaction between people, and hence creating this kind of unfinished, incomplete situation. So if theatricality in the context of carnival can be perceived as a way of communication, can theatricality put an influence on architecture during its design process and to its end users? So in Hartonian's Crisis of the Object, he speculated on the design decisions that several architects made on specific details of the building, and started to dissect them by looking at the theatricality that is embedded in those works and suggesting a new way of looking at space and imaginations induced by the narrative power of design. So this is the Playground Project by Aldo Van Neck, and this column kind of shows the ambiguity of it, of the geometry suggests unexpected playfulness. And Eisenman's technique of shock is used to create tectonic dialogue between the elements of load and supports through this articulation of the column on stairs. And here's another one by Ralph Frantello, of the border wall alternatives, when he kind of turned this wall, which used as a means of surveillance and control, into something that's light and transparent. And there's a question regarding design and violence that's being activated through those narratives. And also OMA's project that used Berlin Wall as a tectonic element of division. And the last one, which is a twisted balustrade by Moth Architecture as well, shows this kind of like potential or possibilities that can be open-ended. Moving forward with a more theoretical approach towards those objects or details that is mentioned previously, Rakitansky's, in his book Tectonic Acts of Desire and Doubts, offers us a different way of looking at architecture through its form and social meaning. And he observes that space in everyday life is always permeated with narratives within a field of discourses and economies. The architecture elements in our surroundings and the way they're arranged can put an influence on us and change the way we perceive space. Social coding in each space can suggest the function, program, and ideologies of the building. Hence, spatiality is defined by narratives embedded in those elements and people's behaviors towards them. And acts, doubts, and desires in this case make us rethink the process of design as play and a continuum, where architecture is not a vessel in which life is contained, but how we as a culture think life in and through architecture. And I'm very intrigued by the connotations that architecture elements can process in Rakitansky's point of view, and the representation in my diagram is very much centered on the storytelling and rhetorical aspect as well. And in addition, temporality is also part of this narrative structure, where sequences start to unfold. Spatiality here is conveyed through multiple scenarios that are created based on different set of relationships between people and architecture elements. So in this catalog, a series of architecture elements and sub-architecture elements, such as furniture, are used as kind of apparatus to generate possible scenarios between those elements and people. And also treating the elements as disembodied objects, the intention is to boast an imagination and thinking freed from physical boundaries and limitations of the traditional drawings. Both objects and subjects are signified to convey certain spatiality based on the relationships they created. It also presents us with a focus on the process of design, where form and uses in architecture are not taken for granted, as in an integrated whole, but rather an anomalous detail in which can be worked through. And just to think about the relationship between users and creation, I think there's a strange and reversible relationship when human encounters objects. And certain interactions between them require a coordination between our motion and cognition. It is a transformational process that can be mental, bodily, physical, constructional, and conceptual. And from there, I start to prototype some sort of catalog of experiences based on different methods. And the first one being repetition. Although elements are being repeated and familiarized in this catalog, people's reaction and interaction towards them are constantly changing and improvising. New meanings and dialogues are generated through the speculation on those repetitive patterns. Repetition here is used as an active force to reverse and against the previous assumption of conventional architectural thinking, creating a peculiar kind of spatiality that commingles with both the familiar and the unfamiliar. So the second strategy is alienation. It takes both condition of the element and people to an extreme so that they are used to against each other and create confrontations. Strategies such as restaging, distancing, or scaling up and down are used here to direct our attention to a sort of metafiction embedded in our everyday life and objects. Improbable scenarios illustrated in this catalog perhaps allow analysis in the process of design as well as potentials for a different construction of space. These chapters will focus on constructing possible plots from elements, people, and interactions, experimenting different elements with temporal conditions, rules, and sequences. Space starts to unfold themselves. Mark Twain once said, quote, "The only difference between reality and fiction is that fiction needs to be credible." Quote. Fiction as a form of knowledge arises in a specific context of communication. It is a process of thoughts and facts being constructed in its own world. Narratives here are used as tool in both the process of design and creation of fiction. The plot play created in this chapter is an investigation on mixing fictional or empirical mode of thinking and spatial production. Such representations offers viewers an opportunity to associate between fiction and everyday life experience, hence to think about how fiction operates in real life. Now, I would like to invite you to our current performance on play. So here's your ticket and here's the cast information in case you want to check out first. And now you can go check out the next video that's on Mirrorboard.